What will the future role of public space be? What are the new policies that public space needs?
To answer this question, we need to look a little bit into the history of public space and the diminishing of the role of public space in cities as the private sector becomes stronger. Public projects are on the decline, and we're basically holding on to the existing public spaces. So I think that when we look at the virus, and you would think that it would give us another hit. Public space is another hit. It will weaken the public sector, and I will go into that a little bit later. It would weaken our ability to operate public systems, and in particularly public transport. It would weaken the budgets for new green projects, because these were kind of like futuristic projects that are now going to be delayed or canceled because of the difficult situation of public authorities in terms of budget. So generally speaking, my immediate reaction to this first question is grim. Namely, I see us defending public spaces, defending public transport, defending public expenditure in the face of a very difficult economic situation. And this in light also to emphasize this again, in light of the fact that we've been into privatizing a lot of public space. I mean, when we look at, let's say, at Disneyland, it looks like public space, but it isn't. It's completely privatized space. When we look at all these shopping malls, they are internalized public space. They're no longer streets with stores around them. So I think that we're entering a difficult period for the future of public spaces. This is by way of introduction.
What will be the future role of our streets? What will be the new forms of human transportation?
This is a very good question, and I think that this may be the central question of this pandemic. I find, and I'm sure you've read, that the hardest hit system in this pandemic is the public transportation system. The public transportation system, I'll give you New York as an example. It carries like 3.5 million people to work every day, crowded in trains, shoulder to shoulder. People simply refuse to board these trains, right? So and that will take a long time before we're able to bring everybody back on the public transportation system. Interestingly enough, in New York, people are starting to use buses, but they're very reluctant to use the trains. I find that the future of public transportation has been really hurt by the pandemic in several ways. Number one, because people have not used the system for many months, many systems have suffered incredible losses in operating revenues. The subsidies are not there. They need to be there. New York will probably need several $1 billion of federal subsidy in order to revive its transportation system. So the first thing that we are seeing already, and I'm giving New York as an example, is the cancellation of investment programs in public transportation. So all the investment money is being channeled to operating expenses and to paying salaries. That means that all of this kind of forward-looking public transportation investments that we've been preparing to for the next decade are going to be either canceled or delayed. Now, public transportation as a way of getting people to work is in increasing competition with the future of transportation, which is the autonomous vehicle. Now, the autonomous vehicle is actually a competitor with the public transportation system because it can bring people to work in a much more efficient way than the private car. It doesn't need any parking. It can crowd itself on crowded highways. It can link itself. There's huge potential for the autonomous vehicle. And I think that this pandemic may have given a push to the development of autonomous vehicles while it has given a push back to the development of public transportation. So if there was a competition between the two, I think that the virus has really changed the playing field in terms of favoring the future of autonomous vehicles. Let me answer that. I have, again, a kind of a very pessimistic view of this. First of all, of course, a lot of people in white-collar occupations can work from home. Now, I, for one, I hate working from home, and I think that pretty much everybody shares this feeling. Everybody likes the idea of the workplace, the idea of mixing, the idea of exchanging. I think that people are a lot more creative when they face each other in a room than when they face each other over a set of television images. And I think that this working from home is a horrible idea. But at the same time, I think that because this has been going on for a few months, that a lot of companies are going to say, hey, why not? Surely the workers don't like it, but they might decide, okay, we're going to save on rent, we're going to have you working from home. So I feel that the push for working from home is not going to come from individuals that want to work from home. I don't think individuals want to work from home, but from corporations that decide that it's easier to have a workforce that doesn't have to come to work. We don't have to pay their high rentals in the city. We don't have to rent expensive offices. We don't have to give them all the benefits. Why don't they work from wherever they are? So I think that if that is true, that working conditions for office workers will become much worse. By the way, in the past, I had a professor in the 50s that his name was Richard Meyer. He wrote the kind of first book called The Communications Theory of Urban Growth. That was maybe in 56. And he was talking, this was very early on about distant working and working by telephone and working with televisions all the way back to 1956. This proved to be a terrible idea, and it has been resisted for decades. And everybody knows that it's a terrible idea, but I think that corporations might find it useful to reduce their bottom line. And not only that, but because you see also certain professions, certain services are being moved abroad to developing countries, let's say accounting services in India, or even legal services in India, that would lead to companies wanting to decentralize white-collar jobs even more and getting fewer people in. Now, this goes hand in hand with the housing affordability crisis in many cities that makes it difficult for young people to rent places in cities and to stay in the city. So all of these things might mitigate in favor of this online work, which I think, in my view, would be a disaster. In my view, and it's not going to be something that's going to be preferred by workers. It's going to be something that is preferred by companies worried about their bottom line. So I don't think people want to leave cities. I don't think people want to get rid of that density and the crowd, and they want to get back to it as soon as possible. The moment you remove one of these restrictions, you see that density recreating itself, even though it is still dangerous. Not as dangerous for young people, but it's still dangerous. But I think that the danger for cities and for the public spaces that you're talking about comes not from individuals not wanting to be in dense environments, but from corporations that might take advantage of that and say, you know what, we're moving our workforce to the periphery, to other countries, and the same way that we moved manufacturing away from cities in years past. Shana, this is a good question. And I agree with you that before the pandemic, at least the planning profession was very much for increasing density. Now, that increase in density has been around, if you look at the literature, for 30 or 40 years. It's not a recent idea. Before, it was against sprawl. Then it changed and it became more against pollution. And then it changed again, it became more against global warming. So the reasons for wanting more density have changed over the years, but there's still this idea that we should create denser cities. And of course, when we talk about density in cities, we have to be a little bit careful, and this is a long discussion because there's what we call, good density and bad density, because some density, like overcrowding in slums in Dhaka, is not a particularly good kind of density, but high density, as long as it doesn't involve overcrowding, is a good thing. And I think, again, that when you look at the success of densification policies of one kind or the other, there's very little success. So it's not like we have cities where we can show that densification policies have really worked. In fact, in my calculation, densities have been in decline in a lot of cities. And while the increase in central cities, they overall, when you look at all the suburbs, they've been in decline. But I think that when you look at it as a political struggle, Shanar, you'd see that there are a lot of people that are resisting densification, like neighborhoods. If you go to a neighborhood and you say, you know what, we're going to allow tall buildings in your neighborhood. You say, no. We are all for density, but somewhere else, not in my neighborhood. So, and then there are people that say, oh, density. When you talk about density in Indian cities, they would say, oh no, it will overwhelm the infrastructure system. We don't have, the water pipes are not wide enough. Okay, put in wider water pipes. No, they don't want to provide better infrastructure. So what I'm saying is, when you look at it, density, not from the point of view of our profession and our belief that we should increase density, but from the point of view of a political struggle, where we say, we need regulations that will allow people to add floors to their buildings, or to allow a second unit in the back of their, and we were hoping that a lot of these densification policies will pass. Now, the enemies of densification have been strengthened. It's not that our position has changed. Our position has not changed. We still believe that after the pandemic, things will return to normal. We're going to be vaccinated. We're not going to be worried about being close to each other, but it doesn't matter. The enemies of density are going to say, oh, no. Densification, bad thing. We need to maintain distance and so on. So I think that from the political perspective, our densification agenda has suffered as a result of this pandemic. It's not that we need to change our minds. It's not that there's nothing wrong with densification and getting cities to be denser. It's just that the political opposition to it has been strengthened by this pandemic, making it more difficult to pass regulations that allow for, taller buildings, smaller plot coverage, adding stories, making smaller flats, eliminating parking requirements, all of these things that could help densification. they're going to get more resistance now because the people are going to say, oh, density was at the heart of this terrible pandemic. It will happen again, and we don't want densification. It might be that we're going to have to start to use another word other than density to
Yeah.
promote the same agenda, like land use intensification or
Yeah.
some other thing like that, that doesn't freak people out by reminding them of the pandemic. Well, we are now engaged in a big intellectual struggle that has to do with the definition of of the city, of what constitutes the physical city, right? Uh, our chief adversaries are the OECD and the European Commission that have just published a big book or report called Cities of the Future, in which they try to eliminate the distinction between urban and rural settlements and come up with a three-way division, which is cities, towns and semi-dense areas, and rural areas. And the problem is that towns and semi-dense areas, we don't know whether they are part of the city or part of the rural areas, right? So like if you look at Java in Indonesia, the whole island is rural, I mean, except for the urban center, but it's very dense. So it's rural dense. And when you look at China around Shanghai, I mean, all the Chinese coast is full of villages that, you know, when you look at the density there, it's fairly high density. It's definitely higher density than Cleveland, you know, or Atlanta. And it's still totally rural area, you know. So if you try to define cities by density, which is what they're trying to do, you lose the boundary of the city, right? It's all about density, you know, so high density here, low density here, it very confusing. So what we're trying to still fight, the good fight of trying to say, no. We have cities. Then we have, maybe we have some peri-urban areas, maybe we have some exurbs, not only suburbs, but they are part of the kind of the commuting range of cities. And then there's rural areas, right? So there is a struggle. It's not completely well defined. You know, when we say Philadelphia, nobody actually knows what you mean by that, except the town, the city center of Philadelphia, but then all of these other towns around it. You know, like Chicago has several towns, several hundreds of municipalities around it that constitute Chicago. Sao Paulo has got 29 municipalities that are Sao Paulo. Buenos Aires has got 19 municipalities that are the greater Buenos Aires, and then a few others that are the super greater, but, you know, so it's not an easy discussion, and it's not going to end anytime soon. Now, in addition to that, you start to have these incredible metropolitan regions, you know, like, so that you have Guangzhou, Hong Kong, connecting to Shenzhen, and then you have Beijing and Tianjin and all of these, or the, you know, the Boston, Washington corridor, or the German, you know, the Rhine-Ruhr corridor, or, you know, there's a lot of places where the distinction of, you know, where does one city end and another one begins are obliterated. So this idea of the city limit, and we need a city limit in order to conduct our analysis, in order to say, you know, densities are going up, densities are going down, you know, it's very difficult. And so I'm just alerting you to the fact that as we speak, there is this enormous discussion about defining the spatial extent of cities. Now, worse than that, I have some colleagues, Neil Brenner at Harvard, now moved to the University of Chicago, and his friend Schmidt, who write books and say, no, the whole world is urban. Because for them, urban is like connected in some way, either by telephone or television or road, or, to the urban system. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the distinction that allows us to say, this is a city and it has a limit and a border, and within that we can discuss, is becoming more difficult to argue. I mean, I still argue that we can say, where a city begins and ends, and okay, and between New York and Philadelphia, we can say, okay, there's a limit here, that's the administrative boundary, where Pennsylvania ends and New York and New Jersey begin, but it's a difficult boundary. And so we haven't been able to settle, and the UN Habitat, who is supposed to be the agency in charge of monitoring the sustainable development goals, where, one of the goals is a city goal, and there are all kinds of goals to be achieved within that, has not been able to actually agree on a definition of what constitutes a city. If you're thinking like in the context of fighting sprawl with an urban growth boundary or a green belt, like saying, like the British in particular were very keen to limit the growth of their cities with green belts. So they created green belts all around the metropolitan areas in England, with 13% of the land in England in green belts. And these green belts were supposed to limit the growth of London and Birmingham and Manchester and Leeds and other British English cities, but they never managed to do that. So when you look at London, there is a green belt, but then there's all this development in the southeast, which is like on the other side of the green belt. And the same with Seoul. You look at Seoul. Seoul had a green belt that was really strictly enforced, right? And the problem was that by the end of the 70s, the green belt was full, and people started to build beyond the green belt. So the problem, you cannot really limit urban expansion. So another great example of that is in Oregon. Oregon's got, Portland, Oregon's got an urban growth boundary. So it's got these 4 counties, and within that, there's a delimited area where you can have urban expansion. And you can only do infill within that urban growth. And Oregon strictly enforces that urban growth boundary since the mid-70s, which has been very successful. Successful in the sense that it was maintained. However, Portland is on the Willamette River, which is the boundary between the state of Oregon and the state of Washington. So across the Willamette River, there's a city called Vancouver, Washington, not to be confused with Vancouver in British Columbia in Canada. Now, Vancouver doesn't have an urban growth boundary. So all the growth and the suburbanization and the sprawl are in the Washington side of the metropolitan area of Portland, but not in Oregon. So all you've done is like push the expansion across the river into Washington, and that's where you see that expansion. So our research on a global sample of 200 cities which we're in the process of publishing as an article called Densify and Expand, measured how much of the population growth of cities between 1990 and 2014 was accommodated in the areas built before 1990, and how much was accommodated in the expansion areas. And on average, we find that 75% was accommodated in the expansion areas, and 25% was accommodated through the densification, back to what we were talking about with Shanar before, of the existing 1990 boundaries. So we're not doing too well with densification, and we have expansion. The Europeans, the OECD people, and the way that they're measuring things have, for me, confused the issue, but they're saying that cities are going to grow a little bit, and that middle area of high density is not going to grow. So they say there's going to be less expansion than what I'm saying. I'm just letting you know that there's controversy is still on. Let me say a couple of things. First, about the housing market, and second, about intermediate cities, right? Okay. So first, what we see is the effect of the pandemic on the housing market. So in New York, it's interesting because I've been talking to real estate agents in New York. What they're saying is a lot of people that were saving to buy an apartment in Brooklyn or are living in a rental unit are saying, no, we're going to buy a second home on the periphery and keep renting our apartment in Brooklyn. So he said that nobody is buying in New York City, nobody's buying. Everybody's buying on the periphery. But if they don't plan to move out, they just want to have, like in Buenos Aires, you remember Buenos Aires, enormous number of people have these weekend houses, right? And you know, at some point, a friend of mine measured like 150 square kilometers of development of weekend houses on the periphery of Buenos Aires, right? So some of those are now becoming, you know, like full-time residents, but for a long time, it was just weekend residents. So I think that the market for this development is going to increase a lot for like second homes, because a lot of New Yorkers are now saying, you know, those that could leave the city are better off than those that had to stay. But it doesn't mean permanent move outside the city, right? So that it just kind of means a kind of a new market is developed, which is like the market for second homes, and which means that people realize that they're going to have to spend more of their budget on housing because they need 2 units now instead of 1, right? So that's going to be part of the effects of that pandemic. People are going to wait for the next pandemic and say, you know, next time you're not going to catch me in a 1-bedroom apartment in New York because I'm going to have a little place on the periphery that I can escape to during the next pandemic. The other story is the story of the mid-sized cities. And again, let me say this. There is a controversy in terms of whether these mid-sized cities have been growing at a slower rate or at a faster rate than the larger cities. And my calculations were that they're going at exactly the same rate. On average, when you look at, you know, whether cities in different countries, which cities are growing faster, I find that all cities are growing at the same rate. So the larger ones, the mid-sized ones, the small ones, they're all growing at the same rate. Paul Krugman, who got a Nobel Prize on this kind of work, disagrees. He says that the advantages of larger metropolitan areas are such that mid-sized cities are not going to be able to compete. That you know, the creative powers of these places, the mix of industries, the resilience to shocks, because there's so many firms that if a few of them go bankrupt, it's enough for the workers to move to another industry, and they, you know, a lot better at handling shocks. And so Krugman is of the opinion that the future lies in the larger metropolitan areas, and that it's going to be difficult for mid-sized cities to compete. When you think about people of your age uh, who vote with their feet, uh, very few are going to mid-sized cities. They go for the big cities because it's more action, more interesting theater, more bars, more art, more interesting people. So unless your generation decides to turn its back to urban, high density, crazy living, uh, we're not going to see that reversal into intermediate sized cities. I think that if we play our cards right, uh, we can really improve the quality of public spaces by removing on-street parking from a lot of places and turning them into outdoor cafes and restaurants and bars. Because right now, as you know, people want to go to bars, they want to go to restaurants, but nobody wants to sit inside. Nobody wants to sit in the crowded restaurants indoors for a couple of hours with too many people, right? So the many parking spaces in the city are being turned into outdoor restaurants and cafes. And you can see it everywhere. And I think that if we push that to say, look at that, look at what we've got here. It's a lot nicer environment if we can get rid of that on-street parking, and we can still keep traffic moving, you know, 1 or 2 lanes of traffic, but we'll kind of almost double the amount of public space that is being used a lot more nicely. And I think there's going to be depending on whether you are able to organize. And again, I'm talking to you as in political terms, right? There'll be, of course, a pushback to bring back parking, you know, by the people who have cars and want to park them on the street, right? But if we can make the argument that look at how much better the city is with so much more space, so much more public space being used more appropriately and more convivially than just having a car parked in the middle of it, we're going to be better off. So this is at least one frontier where I think we can win a fight if we make a good case. If you people like yourself can make a good case of getting rid of on-street parking and turning more of the street. I mean, I'm not pushing as far as saying let's turn them into pedestrian malls, right? I'm saying even one step before pedestrian malls, we're a lot better off removing all of this on-street parking and changing it into outdoor space that we can use more effectively. So this is the political struggle that should be fought now. And that is exactly that. You know, how do we widen the sidewalk at the expense of on-street parking in order to make to make these public spaces more useful and more effective? And that's, I think, a worthwhile fight. And I think that if you do it now, if you organize now, when and kind of show some designs, look at, take pictures, interview people, get the political support that you need to do that, I think that that is a fight that can be won.
What should be the role of technology and AI in rethinking the possibilities for public space? Can AI be used to control part of the city according to unexpected events?
I work with people who are in AI. They are very worried about using the pandemic to do contact tracing, to follow people, to create more social control in the name of protecting people from the pandemic. So the people that I work with who have cell phone data for like 100 million users are very, very strict in saying that they will not do contact tracing and that they will not follow people and that they want to do whatever possible to maintain privacy, to maintain individual rights, and to not compromise privacy in the name of fighting the coronavirus. And I think that that the AI people have to realize that, because in many cases, as you know, the coronavirus has been used to fight democratic movements, whether it's in Hungary, where Orban is declared basically martial law, taking away powers from the parliament, where in a number of countries this is being used to curtail democracy. And AI is one of these tools that can offer some relief from the pandemic, but at a very high cost that we're trying to avoid. I want to go back and talk a little bit about AI and the surveillance state, and to note that I think London, I don't have my numbers in front of me, but has a million video cameras in public spaces, and that the public space has become a way of instituting mass surveillance, and that we don't really understand what is going on, but when you look at some movies, I mean, recently I saw, one of these Jason Bourne movies, with Matt Damon, and he's running through London, and there are cameras that are tracing him everywhere, and so that and that because of the AI and all this technology, all this facial recognition technology and all of that, when you think about what public space can become as a result of this AI, it's a nightmare because the cameras together with the facial recognition, together with the AI, would basically mean that they will know where you are at any time you step out of your apartment. And that in itself, I think, would be really compromising this quality of public space, which is like being nowhere, like being lost in the crowd. And that is something that I am very worried about. So that when you are talking about public spaces in the 21st century, in 2020, with the pandemic and with the AI that we have now, which is like very close to facial recognition, and all of these video cameras in public spaces, this is something that we don't yet understand, but I suspect that it has some terrible consequences.
Yeah, on that regard, I was like linking to the very beginning on the defense of the public space and how in the public space as public platform, it's inserting these surveillance mechanisms which are private. So how can we develop the correct policies in order to know who is the owner of this data and how this data is used at the end? Because like public space is the specific space where the civic community gathers, but now it's now being traced and tracked by private corporations, and you don't know the use of that. So how can we feel like comfortable in the public space?
But look, Soledad, yes, I understand. And I think that that is why you had this pushback from Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, that was where Google was trying to create that. You know, it was trying to do all of this video cameras. I don't know. Do you know of this project in Toronto? The Sidewalk Labs?
Yeah,
project?
and it's recently canceled, the Google. Yeah.
Pardon?
The project with
Yeah.
Google has
Yeah.
end up the collaboration. So
Yeah, that's right. But because it was an incredible public outcry about exactly what Soledad was saying, which is that the private company that's collecting data on individuals in the city. However, Soledad, I want to point out to you that sometimes it's private companies, but sometimes it's government. And sometimes that government, and I don't want to remind you of the history of Argentina, but sometimes that government is exactly trying to do that, which is, you know, like trace all the suspected terrorists that are trying to organize against the government. So I don't think that government can be trusted more than the private sector can be trusted. I'm worried about both, you know, whether it's in the public sector or in the private sector. I'm worried about that surveillance.
Yeah, sure. And especially when like the population don't actually know they are being like traced, whether for the private or for the government. I mean in both. In both.
Of course. And it's interesting that that we have no way of becoming invisible, and we are starting to demand from Google and these other social platforms the ability to erase our history. You know, like for me, right now, I have achieved immortality. I cannot get my name out of Google no matter what I do. You know, my name is in so many different places, in so many different papers, in so many. Suppose I wanted to vanish. I can't vanish. I'm totally immortal. You know, like I'm out there, you know, in all of these different ways. You know, so we have to start thinking about, you know, how do we erase our presence rather than how to become more present. You know, at least because we're losing that ability to become invisible. I give you all the encouragement that I need, because I think, like I said to you personally, some of these battles can be won if you do it properly and if you do it now. In other places, we have to retreat and kind of push back. But in some, we can move ahead. So like on the sidewalks project, I think it's perfectly realizable. Public transportation is really being clobbered right now. And I'm more worried about the economics of it, you know, because the economics of it are such that these public transportation systems are losing anyway, right? even when they're operating under the best conditions. So now when they're not operating under best conditions, they're going to demand a lot of subsidies or go bankrupt or have to curtail services, and then you get worse patronage. You know, this is a vicious circle. It's going to be very, very difficult to overcome that crisis in the public transportation system. I hope I was not too pessimistic in my assessments. I'm just trying to be realistic as to what is confronting us so that we know how to conduct ourselves in this very difficult time.
Yeah.
Right, exactly, yeah.